Stanford University.
Well, hello again, and welcome once more to the History and Geography of Current Global Events. Our topic for today is a pretty grim one, the so-called Democratic Republic of Congo, a site of some extraordinary bloodshed and violence, a very dismal scene all in all. So bear with me as we go through the history and geography of this region. Just to start out with a map of Central Africa, you can see how clearly the DRC dominates the central part of the continent. It's a vast country. And as I usually do, I'll go first through some news stories. And if you remember last week, I started by showing some headlines about how things in the Caucasus were settling down and were becoming more peaceful, supposedly, and then followed with a series of articles recounting violence. And I'll do the same thing here today. Why not? People's Daily Online. It's interesting. A lot of articles on the DR Congo in Chinese newspapers. China is very interested in Africa these days. It's invested lots of money in it. And so there's a real interest in the region. But here we see this article from January 25th. Normalcy returns to eastern DR Congo. Mediators there. Kenyan President Kibaki, former President Obasanjo of Nigeria, saying things had significantly improved since yet one more peace agreement signed recently. But again, if you actually look through what's been happening since that was published in the end of December, what do we find? We find some deep violence. We'll talk about the Lord's Resistance Army later on, a particularly vicious group based originally in northern Uganda. The Rwandan Hutu rebels, raiding refugee camps, killing people. That's par for the course. Here again we have raids on refugee camps, violent assault on AIDS workers, stealing their belongings. Here we have again, now these are all since January 25th. This is from February 10th. Army chiefs of DR Congo and Uganda, Central African Republic, meeting together to try to figure out how to handle this group, the LRA, or Lord's Resistance Army, which is terrorizing a pretty broad swath of all three countries, just trying to figure out what they can do about it. Here we have, again, militias causing havoc. Again, this is back to the LRA. Ugandan forces had pulled out after attacking them. The LRA is regrouping. They're attacking villagers. This is going on every day. And then just to round things out, 10 minutes before I got here, I just did a Google News search to see what's coming up right now within the last few minutes. Rebels murdering women in DR Congo, food running short, reconciliation, to the extent it's happened, which is quite a stretch, threatened by rights abuse, rape issues coming up again, refugees flooding Congo Brazzaville, that's across the river in the Republic of the Congo, a different country altogether, one that has its own problems but not nearly as serious as the DR Congo. So those are just the first stories to come up. So pretty gruesome situation. One thing that several writers and activists have noted is there has been surprisingly little attention in the news media to this situation, which is, almost all would agree, the deadliest war since World War II, although there are some real controversies over how many people have actually died. But what this blogger did was look at the New York Times, and in blue, looked at coverage of Darfur, which is Western Sudan, a situation where there are extreme human rights abuses and warfare, to be sure, but compared it then to news coverage of the DR Congo, and then looked at estimated deaths in those conflicts. And they're giving here Darfur about 300,000 dead, and in DR Congo about 5.5 million dead. And that 5.5 million is the usual figure you see. I have seen figures up to 6.9 million, but I should say there's a recent study that has challenged that and said that actual deaths from violent conflict in DR Congo has been more like 900,000. And it's a real troublesome issue to just try to figure out how many people have died, because most of them are dying from lack of food, from diseases, from trauma and other causes. And these are associated with the war, but it's difficult to say exactly what is the causal agent, right? It's not like you're counting battle deaths here by any means. It's mostly, well, vast majority of these people are dying are civilians, and they're dying because of for a variety of different reasons. So it's difficult to know just what those numbers are. But if it's 900,000, it's still a huge figure compared to, say, deaths of U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan or Iraq. It's a gargantuan figure. Anyway, here's the, if you're interested in the article, I put a link to it in my blog so you can follow that up. It was from Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, doing a very in-depth study of African wars, casualties, and so on. So anyway, they're estimating 900,000. This is between 2001 and 2007, and actually the war started in 1997. So if you count the longer time period, it would be a higher figure. I think I'm missing a little bit here. Let me see if I can. Yeah, suggested that included deaths that would have happened anyway. So that's the tricky issue. What would have happened? Another issue is sexual violence, and the war in Congo has probably seen more sexual violence than any other war. May be debatable, but certainly it has been very, very extensive. Purposeful campaigns of raping women as part of sort of campaigns of terrorism, ways of terrorizing the population. And if anyone reads Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times, he has one writer who's really hit this issue hard, traveled in it extensively, and many thanks to one of the members of the class for sending information on it's a PBS documentary that's going to be HBO. Oh, I can't watch it then. I didn't even notice that. Oh, well. That's Thursday night, I believe, right? Anyway, but he writes a lot about it. And reading his work, you come across really horrible things. Auto-cannibalism. When militias cut flesh from living victims and force them to eat them. Or re-rape of women being raped over and over again. So if you want war horrors, Eastern Congo is the place to find them. Perhaps one of the most, well, all these things are troublesome, but when you look at the way Pygmies, and that is a problematic term, and I'll get to that in a second, but it refers to probably the most indigenous inhabitants of the rainforest, people of very, very short stature. I'll show you some slides of them later on, have been hunted down in some cases and have had campaigns of virtual extermination against them. Many Congolese regard them as subhuman, and there's a belief that eating their flesh can confer magical powers. Now, I don't know how many people believe this, but there are well-authenticated cases of Pygmies being hunted down, killed, and eaten by militia members, as well as systematic rapes and other issues, which some of these groups puts them in some jeopardy of survival. Of course, reports vary depending on how you look at it. Yeah, and I just want to mention that the term pygmy is often considered a pejorative or negative term, but there is no other term to replace it. That's the problem. There are a variety of different ethnic groups in this broader category, and the only overarching term we have is pygmies. But they're distinctive people, hunter-gatherers in the rainforest, sort of distinctive culturally. And I'll get back to them briefly when I come to the sort of historical overview section. But anyway, a few words on the geography of the DR Congo. What I did here was to find an equal area projection map. Most of our map projections are not equal area. When you make a map of the world, you have to distort, right? You can't take a spherical shape and flatten it out without distorting. So you distort shape, or you distort size, or you distort both. You have to distort. But most of the maps we use distort size, and they exaggerate the high latitudes. Some much more than others. The Mercator is sort of the infamous projection that makes Greenland look larger than South America. But even in a lot of the standard projections we use still show them as sort of too large. But this is an equal area projection. You can see how Russia looks so stretched out in this way. So it distorts in the far north and south by stretching things. But then I took our DR Congo, but just to show you how large it is, there it is tilted and juxtaposed to the United States. So you can see from the Canadian border down to the Gulf Coast and about halfway across the country, or putting it in Europe just to get an idea of how large of a place we're talking about. Population-wise, I've sort of taken this chart and extended it out to the best information we have. Now, it's not like they're conducting reliable censuses in the DR Congo, so you have to take any sort of quantitative information with a grain of salt, but best estimates right now, close to 70 million people, and you can see a very fast rate of growth, and the curve is not quite as steep as it was, and that probably has a lot to do with wartime mortality, although it's tricky to know anything like this for certain. But it's a larger population than Britain has, or than France has, or than Italy has, just to give you sort of a comparative sense. So it's this big country with a lot of people, relatively speaking. And boy, does it have mineral resources. It is a great treasure trove of a variety of resources. So here's just showing some of the main ones. Diamonds, big concentration in the Kasai region, also around Kisangani. A lot of these are diamonds that can be mined out of the river gravels alluvially. And that's actually a problem. When minerals can be extracted in very low-tech methods, like forcing people to winnow out sand out of the rivers, then that means militias can exploit these resources. They can basically enslave people and force them to do the mining, as opposed to the deep underground mining that, well, there can certainly be exploitation there, but it takes a lot of capital, it takes a big effort, and it's not the sort of thing where a bunch of guys with AK-47s can go into a village, enslave people, and force them to do this. The far south, and note, and I'll get back to this, how DR Congo sort of has this salient or extension pushing down into Zambia. This is the copper belt. Obviously a lot of copper, but it probably has more cobalt than any place in the world. These are tend to be deep underground, highly capitalized mines. This was the focus of Belgian mining activity. And then the east is a big swath with lots of gold, lots of tin, manganese and other things. And what has really come on board, as you can see up here in the far northeast, is coltan. Probably nobody heard of coltan 10 years ago, but if you follow this issue, coltan comes up all the time. Coltan is a sort of a trade name for columbite and tantalite. These are minerals. You can see complex chemical formula, and they contain niobium and tantalum. You can just, if you want to put these on your sort of periodic chart, tantalum is right below niobium, so they have similar properties. And what are they used for? Cellular phones, jet engines, rockets, cutting tools, hammer lenses, X-ray films. Well, should I continue? Tremendously important for a variety of high-tech products. Corrosion-resistant fasteners, high-temperature furnace parts. Oh, suture clips even. Oh, mesh to repair bone after cancer. Valuable, valuable stuff. And northeastern DR Congo has the lion's share of this mineral. It's found elsewhere, but I don't think any other place has it quite in the concentrations that you have here. And it's not deep. Well, let me show you mining operation of coltan. So that's what most of the mining extraction looks like. They're not winnowing it out of river gravels. They're digging down for it, but they're not digging down very deep. It obviously doesn't take much capital. And again, this is the sort of thing where militias can come in and enslave villagers, force them to mine, and get a lot of money out of it. There's a documentary film, Blood Coltan. Has anyone seen it? I have not. Has anyone seen it? Let me know if you think it's worthwhile. It was widely reported that when Sony came out with the PlayStation 2, demand for coltan shot up, that there was an immediate increase in casualties in the DR Congo. I found many reports of this. I'm a bit skeptical. It's just hard to imagine when coltan is used for so many different things that the PlayStation 2 would have been so popular that alone could have had a major effect. But it is interesting that there are plenty of articles that allege this. Trying to link our consumer electronic popular entertainment to violence and death in DR Congo. It's just another map, and this is a pretty nice map because what it's doing is it's showing you some of these resources. Here's coltan, AU is gold, we have tin ore, and then showing some of the different militias that are active here. So what you have had is wars that started for a variety of different reasons, but by the late 1990s, early years of the new decade, in many cases, it's basically degenerated into different militias fighting for access to resources because those resources were so valuable and could bring so much money to them. So here you can see these are all different militias, all of whom have been guilty of some pretty heinous crimes against civilians and others, fighting over these resource zones, essentially. And here's another fairly interesting French map of this. I like it because it puts it in broader context. So you can see a zone of very rich mineral deposits extending from South Africa, which is one of the world's mineral powerhouses, up through Zambia and Zimbabwe, up into the DRC. Sort of that's the central, highly mineralized zone, distinct from the oil zone, which is all coastal. So from northwestern Angola up through Congo, Gabon, up into Nigeria. Now it's even up to Ghana. Ghana's recently discovered oil. So that's where the oil is. DRC has some oil, but DRC has just a tiny little window on the ocean, and so it really doesn't have much. The eastern part of the country doesn't have the resources that the west, the west doesn't have the resources of the east. It's the east where the real heavy-duty resources are. And they're also telling you what are the French-speaking, Portuguese, and English-speaking areas here on the map. So Angola, Mozambique, former Portuguese colonies. That's Lusophone Africa, if you will, from the old Latin term Lusitania for Portugal. And again, I'll put all these maps up on the online so you can see them. DR Congo has a lot of forestry resources. In pretty good shape. There's been some deforestation here, a lot of it associated with simple population expansion and clearing for agriculture. But it doesn't have really a good enough transportation network for the real extensive, commercially driven deforestation that you find in many other countries. But just basic tropical rainforest is in green here, so you can see the whole central and sort of north-central part of the country. Mostly tropical rainforest, except where it's been cleared for local farming. And the south is a mixture of savanna, grassland, sort of woodlands, and that's true up in the north too, where more of the population lives. And I'll show you some population density maps in a second. It has huge water resources as well. The Congo River, and this is just showing the whole Congo River basin, and the Congo River sweeping out and going to the sea here, is the world's second largest river in volume after the Amazon. Bigger than the Mississippi, bigger than the Yangtze. Recently they've discovered there are areas of this river that are 750 feet deep, which makes it by far the deepest river. So it is a vast, vast river. But it's quite distinctive from the Amazon, because the Amazon is all, except way up at the headwaters, but otherwise the Amazon is in a low, flat-lying basin. You can sail a steamship up the Amazon River to Iquitos, Peru. Congo River is nothing like that because Africa is a plateau continent. And most of Congo, it's a low-lying plateau. It's 1,000, 2,000 feet above sea level, so it's not very high. But you can only sail up the river to about there, and then you hit big waterfalls, and rapids, essentially. And then you can, and then it's calm and placid up to about here, and then you hit more rapids. So it's certainly used extensively for interior navigation, and I'll show you a map of that in a second. But you can't go, you can't sail up it from the ocean. What that means, though, is it has tremendous hydroelectric potential if it were ever to be used. And there is hydroelectric energy. Let me jump up here a second. But there are also plans to really extend it. And of course, hydroelectricity brings a lot of environmental problems, and it floods people out. And so I don't want to say that it's any sort of a panacea, but DR Congo could produce all the electricity that Africa consumes, basically with just a couple of massive dams. You could produce, in one dam site, could produce twice the power of China's Three Gorges Dam. And that's just one of many, many sites. So it probably has more hydroelectric potential than any other country in the world. So that is vast. Again, just to show you the political boundaries here, and I sort of added the river, and you have sort of rapids right here, and then you have a broad area where it's navigable. And just in case anyone's interested in wildlife here, if you know the difference between chimps and bonobos, a bonobo is sometimes called a pygmy chimp, very different animal, completely different behavior. But it is absolutely constrained by the river. It can't cross the river. So you have chimps here, you have chimps here, you have chimps here, and you have bonobos there because neither one of them can cross this vast river. So it makes for a barrier for wildlife as well. And here's a fascinating map that shows the transportation system. And it may take a little bit of time to sort of dissect this map. So we have here railway and railway not operational. The one thing I always insist is people will call DR Congo a developing country, but for the last 30 years it has been doing the opposite of developing. It's been de-developing, if you will. Its infrastructure has been collapsing. So a lot of railways here, this railway out to Angola, not operational. So plenty of these have, even the railways have fallen apart. Highways, note this, so we have paved all-weather highways, so we have a few, gravel highways, and earth tracks. Now, what an earth track means is, if it's been dry for a long time, you can drive on it really slowly. If it's been raining, forget it. It's going to turn into a quagmire. Yeah.
Is that all of them?
Yeah. That's the transport system of this country. Yeah, so how do you get there? Well, let's see. So, you note right here, cataracts and rapids. Here. So you can come up the Congo River, and then we have an all-weather highway and a railway up to Kinshasa, the capital. Then you can go up the river to Kisangani. Note there's a little railway. Then you can get back into the river here. What's crucial is this connection, because this is where the big copper and cobalt mines are. That's been the lifeblood of the country. You need to get those resources out. So you take them out by this operational railway, and then you go into another river, then you come down, then you get back into the railway system, then back into the river. And other thing I was trying to think of, well, okay, let's say if I were in Goma, this is the biggest city in the east, and I wanted to get to some place like Mabuchi Mai. How would you do it? Well, there is a road here, but no, that's an earth track. So most of the year, forget about it. How would you do it? It's sort of an interesting mathematical problem to figure out the easiest way. But you're basically going to have to, come up in a road which goes back and forth between paved and gravel, then get maybe in a railway, then back into the river. Then you could go up. You have to get back in a railway here because you got rapids. You can stay in the railway here. Oh, it's not operational. No. So I guess you got to stay in the river. Then you can come on the railway. So it's not very well tied together or integrated. Let's put it that way. There's a few areas that connect. Mostly, it doesn't, and it takes. It's very difficult to get there. Of course, you can fly. There are some airports. There's an airport in Kisangani. There's an airport down here. So there are some airports. Yes.
The article about the hydroelectric plant was dated 2005, so is that ever really serious?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's serious plans, I suppose, but it demands security. And this is, the hydroelectric facilities would be in this area here where the big rapids are. And this is a relatively secure area, but not entirely by any means. And the country just doesn't have the kind of governmental apparatus to pull it off.
So is there really no stable government structure?
Well, there's something like a government that governs some areas, kind of, sort of, sometimes. Maybe the best way to put it. Well, we'll work through this as we go along. I mean, it has a capital. It is recognized. I mean, it has those sorts of aspects. One of the what I've done here is I took an older population map based on the 1970 census, because I don't think there's probably been any census since then. I don't know how accurate it is. I'll show you another population density map. And then I put the four major lingua francas, or common languages. There are several hundred languages spoken here, but four of them have official status along with French, so it's part of Francophone Africa. So French is the national integrative language, right, that ties the whole country together with the rest of Francophone Africa and obviously with parts of Europe. But then there are 4 languages that are used in primary schools. They were even used in the Belgian period in primary schools. And they're common languages that most people can speak, and that's because a fairly narrow population is fluent in French. But virtually everybody here is going to be fluent in one of these 4 languages. But note how it divvies up the country. Swahili in the east, Lingala. Lingala is an interesting language. It wasn't really an indigenous language. It was sort of based on indigenous languages, but contrived by the Belgians as a language they could use in their colonial enterprise. Luba, Luba, that's based on an indigenous kingdom. Kikongo, that's also based on an indigenous kingdom. So these are deeply rooted languages. Swahili is spoken on the east coast. And you can see how these different regions, so the different population clusters that have their distinctive languages. And if I were to go back to that earlier map, you could see going from these Kikongo areas to these Luba-speaking areas, it looks like they're pretty close together, but really difficult to get from one to another because of transportation issues. And all these languages, well, except for Luba, really, but all the others extend across the border. So here's the Kikongo, Kituba. These are closely related languages, often considered one. So here in this part of DRC, but then in a big part of Congo and a big part of Angola, or Lingala, you can see in the DRC, but also in neighboring Congo. And Swahili, where people speak Swahili as their first language, is right along the coast here. And then the interior is this broad zone of Swahili as a trading language, a lingua franca, a sort of a common language. So none of these language communities ties DR Congo together. What they do is, to a certain extent, link them with places across the border. And that's a very common issue in many parts of Africa. Well, here's another population density map. This is based on remote sensing, using satellite imagery to try to figure out where people are rather than trusting censuses. I don't know particularly how accurate. It shows population much more sort of evenly distributed than that other map did, but you can definitely see real concentrations. And basically, it gives us sort of a number of what we could think of as core regions. This would be the Kikongo-speaking area. Kinshasa, though, it's right on the border. Kinshasa itself is Lingala and Kikongo-speaking. And then the far east, where all the extreme bloodshed is, you can see it's quite a densely populated area. And note Rwanda and Burundi. This is Uganda. Rwanda and Burundi are the most densely populated parts of Africa. Very fertile soil here. This is the Great Rift Valley. You can see these elongated lakes. This is where Africa is splitting apart. These tectonic forces in a few million years, East Africa will separate and a sea will come up through here. But right now what it does is it creates these very, very deep lakes, but it also creates volcanoes. There's volcanism associated with it. And those volcanoes create very fertile soil, at least many of them do. Africa, much of Africa has very old and impoverished soils, not fertile. But here along the rift zone, quite a different story. Those volcanoes, through their periodic eruptions, have created some very fertile soil, and that's one thing that's given rise to these very dense populations. Yes?
There recently have been very substantial oil resources identified in Rwanda and Uganda in the Rift Valley. Do you know if any of those are also in Congo?
I haven't heard of any. Oil has been found. It's been found to the north in Chad, and that's being exploited now. And there have been some. I knew about Uganda, but I didn't know about Rwanda.
Yeah, that's very substantial deposits of oil in Rwanda and in the Rift Valley.
Yeah.
And that was, and further south,
right,
which was a very significant part of the revolution in Kenya. Because it was really the tribes in the Rift Valley that were involved.
That was a very violent place, and there was a real. I have to look into that. That's quite interesting. Yeah, these are new findings. An awful lot of this area hasn't been explored. I imagine it'd be extremely difficult to do oil exploration in that region, considering the security problem. But that's something really worth looking into. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
Sorry, where did you say you get this map from, or what's the source?
Oh, that's actually one of my own maps, way of speaking. I mean, I didn't make it, but it's from my textbook, Diversity and Globalization. So we just hired cartographers to do this, a firm that's basis on remote sensing, and I just took it and expanded it. So it was just, that's why it's a little bit fuzzy. But actually, the resolution was surprisingly good to be able to do that.
Is getting the population from the remote sensing, is that something like a newer?
It's fairly new. I think Oak Ridge Laboratories has done a lot of this work, interestingly enough. And I think it's regarded as pretty solid. Yeah, it's not perfect, but I probably trust it more than I would the 1970 census. Oh, how do they actually do it technically? I don't really know. That's just one of those mysteries. People know how to do these wonderful things, and I'm glad they do it. I don't know.
If you happen to come across a good source on that, maybe you could post that on YouTube.
Okay, I can look into that.
I have a question about the Kinshasa area.
Yeah.
You said that this is Congo area. Do they sort of dominate the country politically as the ethnic
Well-
group, sort of like Christians do in Afghanistan, just because they're sort
Yeah.
of in the capital
Well,
area?
yeah, not really. And now you'll see this on maps later on. And the map is a little misleading. I've just sort of shown this as a core region. But Lingala comes down in and includes Kinshasa. So Kinshasa is more Lingala than Kikongo. But outside of it, down to because Lingala went up the river, because that's how the Belgians were pushing in, was up the river. And so if you go south of it, then you're in Kikongo area. But no, they don't dominate. But later on, I'll show you the electoral maps. There's very distinct correlation between sort of linguistically defined communities and voting patterns. There was a good election in 2006, pretty good, and I'll be able to show you those maps. Was there another question or comment? But this is a diamond-producing area. This is the old Luba kingdom, an indigenous kingdom, one of the stronger ones, and so that's another center. This was the center of where Joseph Mobutu, later known as Mobutu Sese Seko, who ruled the country for 32 years and ran it into the ground. That was his base of power. That's a Lingala-speaking area. And then finally, in the far south, where you don't have much rural population density, but you got some pretty big cities because, again, that's where the big commercial mines are located. So it's a country with these competing centers for power associated with different languages, different ethnic groups, really making it hard to compare. And I want just to show you this city. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but that was Mobutu's, what do they call it? Versailles in the jungle. He spent an amazing amount of money. I mean, look at this. Built a nuclear bunker that could house 500 people, connected to the Ubangi River by secret tunnels. Now most of this is overgrown with vegetation, or it was, although one of the militia movements has taken it over and is using it. So I don't know if this particular palace, he built a number of palaces in this city. I don't know exactly what's happening to it. To give you some comparison of the DR Congo, I thought I'd just give you some data comparing it to a couple other countries. So we can take Luxembourg. I like it because we're talking about going from 2,000 to 2 million square kilometers. So we're talking about 3 orders of magnitude difference in size. Population not quite as extreme. Luxembourg has about 300,000 people versus 70 million. But then look at the annual, the GDP, the total value of goods and services produced in those countries per year. And Luxembourg comes out at more than twice that of DR Congo. So that's a pretty sort of telling issue. If we look at governmental revenues, you can't even compare them. We're going from 700 million to 17 billion. My comparison that I went for was, here's a country with an annual revenue of 863, which is the vast Principality of Monaco. I was going to put this on my post this morning, and my wife said, no, Monaco's, everybody knows there's all that money there from gambling. Find something else. So I compared it to Haiti. And Haiti has a significantly higher annual government revenue. Haiti has, 9 million people versus the 70 million. and Haiti, obviously an extremely poor and not well-run country, but yet vastly more developed in many senses than DR Congo. And it's aid, foreign aid. They rely very. I mean, it's the government functions because of international donors. Really, it can't on its own. And I just have to give you an example of Stanford campus. That's how big Monaco is. There it is. Took me a while to put that map together, but it was fun. It was fun to do so. So, and Stanford's annual revenue. You know what it is? 3.5 billion, I think. So just to give you 5 times the size of the revenue on this campus than the country of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Interesting map I found. I couldn't actually find the date to it. I think it's pretty recent, but this is just showing food security, and the entire country is shown as having borderline food insecurity or acute food insecurity and risk of worsening for essentially the whole region, with humanitarian emergency in some of these areas in the east. Also, we can see that many of its neighbors are not much better. That's Darfur, for example, central Somalia. So there are places that are worse off, but it's food insecurity is a huge issue. And here, just to show you, this graph shows a couple of things. One is, well, first of all, I put in a line here for 1989, which is the beginning of the end of the Cold War, right? Berlin Wall comes down in that year. And you can see in green the gross domestic product per capita, per person. You can see it declining, sort of leveling out, and then precipitously plummeting with the end of the Cold War. DRC was propped up to a certain extent by the U.S. and by other Western countries during the Cold War. Desire on the part of the U.S. government not to see communist revolutionaries take control there. So DR Congo, then known as Zaire, benefited from that. And when the Cold War ended, Western interest dropped. And that's just part of it, though. It really was declining for a long period of time. This is just sort of what kicked it off the edge. What's interesting, though, is under age 5 mortality declined through the whole period. And this shows periods of conflict, although I would color the whole thing in beige. It's not like the conflict ever ended. But it's interesting, the GDP it continued to drop and then sort of leveled off. It was before the conflict came that serious economic collapse occurred. And this decline in under age 5 mortality, this is true in most of the world, even the poorest countries of the world. And a lot of it has to do with pretty inexpensive techniques of oral rehydration therapy, where you just need the right balance of salt. The government doesn't do much in DRC, but church groups do, Catholic Church in particular, and others. And it's really pretty cheap to supply these oral rehydration therapies because most babies die from dehydration from diarrhea. And there are these sort of new techniques that are cheap and quite effective. So it's still, we're still talking about, I don't have the information on this side. It was there, I guess I got rid of it. But it's still frightfully high. Okay, let me pause for a second, take a drink. And then I'll run through my historical overview, as I always do. Start with Pygmies, because again, it's believed that these were sort of the original inhabitants of the rainforest, but like they say, common view, but there's no archaeological support, ambiguous support from genetics and linguistics. They're trying to do a lot of genetics work, and it's going to take a long time before we really know. One issue is all of these so-called pygmy groups speak languages of their much larger agricultural neighbors. They don't have their own languages by and large. But it's interesting, in studying their language, they find that a lot of the vocabulary is distinctive, dealing with things like honey collecting and hunting and forest sort of things that are very deep in their culture. But what seems to have happened was these pygmies had been hunter-gatherers in the rainforest. Then agricultural people started moving in, and they developed relationships, not equal relationships, but symbiotic relationships, where the pygmy supplied the forest products, hunted products, gathered products, and then traded for metal tools, which the agriculturalists had, as well as crops that the agriculturalists grew. The Pygmies were in a subordinate relationship and ended up losing their own language and borrowing that of their neighbors. But there's still a number of these groups, and you can see it's these groups here in East that are really in a dire situation now. Now, I don't know how tall this guy is, so the only photo I could find is showing stature. Adult men are usually under, almost always under 5 feet tall, women about 4.5 feet tall. So they certainly are small in stature. And there's some recent reports that claims that they have by far the shortest life expectancy. I don't know how well authenticated this is. There have been a few studies. But since some of these studies suggest that their original way of livelihood was it was not easy. Rainforests are not easy environments to live in. Difficult to get enough calcium for bone growth. Calcium is probably a real limiting factor. And pygmies mature very early and age much faster, at least according to a number of studies. I don't know how well established that is, but there's some very, very big differences. But starting a couple thousand years ago, people speaking Bantu languages, that's a linguistic family or subfamily, originating sort of where Nigeria and Cameroon come together here. They had already developed agriculture. Agriculture developed in West Africa quite a long time ago. And they had iron tools, actually pretty high quality iron tools. And later copper and bronzes as well. So they had a good metallurgy, good agricultural system, lots of different crops. And they started moving south. There's some controversy of how it happened. They seem to have moved across first, and then they spread farther south, and by about 1,000 years ago had spread down to the tip of the continent. Today, if we look at a map of, here's just a language map. These are all languages in a broad family called the Niger-Congo family, originated in West Africa. These are at subfamilies, and Bantu is the largest of these subfamilies. And you can see all these languages in this brown pattern. So they're closely related languages, pretty obvious affinity with an origin sort of up here. And it was this Bantu migration that brought more complex societies to Congo Basin, agricultural, metallurgical, and so on. Another important language group are people as the Nilo-Saharan language family. Completely different family, probably originating in this area here. And you can see that does expand into the DRC as well. People speaking this language were also farmers, and at metallurgy, they were more famous for their cattle pastoralism, for raising cattle, which is the early Bantu speakers really did not. They had goats, but they didn't have cattle. Actually, a lot of these people are famous for their close association with cattle. You've probably heard about the Maasai who live here, who drink cattle. They drink milk, and they also bleed the cattle and mix the milk and the blood. That's sort of a staple food. So there's a lot of different groups, and I don't want to imply that they all have the same way of life. They don't. But this was another group that sort of moved into the area, into this northeastern part of Congo, bringing agriculture, cattle, again, metal tools. And it's often been thought that these represent different races. Now, this is a view that is in disrepute now. They're trying to sort of sort it out through genetics, which they're finding a very, very complicated set of puzzles. I mean, one thing we know is there's more genetic diversity in Africa than in all the rest of the world. That's where humans originated, and so that's had longer time to accumulate mutations and different changes. But the Twa would be a pygmy group, Hutu a Bantu group, and Tutsis were originally one of these Nilo-Saharan pastoral people who moved into the area with their cattle and established kingdoms. Eventually, they started speaking the same language as the Hutu, who greatly outnumbered them. But the Tutsi had come into especially Rwanda and Burundi, but also parts of the DRC many hundreds of years ago, conquered local local farming people. It sort of became an aristocracy. But over time, the distinctions started to narrow. Intermarriage, Tutsis lost their original language, and most scholars think that the sort of differences were disappearing until the colonialists came in. The Belgians especially, the Germans who were nearby as well, they like to make racial distinctions. This is a sort of divided rule. It works for a colonial occupier to stress the differences. And the Tutsi, who tend to be taller, more angular in their facial features, they were considered a superior race by the Belgians and by the Germans when the Germans were there. And Hutu, and especially Pygmy, were considered inferior, so the Tutsis got some benefits from that. They were definitely a minority, as they still are, but they were sort of had this kind of a ruling class background, if you will. Yes?
Well, I'm just wondering if any studies have been done in terms of malnutrition.
Oh, for Pygmies, why they are so short,
Because
yeah.
the photo you showed, they all had swollen bellies,
Yeah.
which is a sign of malnutrition.
Yeah, that's a sign of protein deficiency, right? Kwashiorkor, is that right? Anyone know medical policy? Right. And yeah, protein, yeah, they do hunt, but oftentimes it's really hard to come back with much meat. It is believed, though, that it is not just a dietary thing. I mean, we know that the Japanese were considered very short people, right? The Chinese call them the dwarf barbarians, if you go back. And then the Japanese started eating a lot more protein and getting a lot more calcium, and they're not very short anymore. So sometimes you can see just a diet does make a change. But what I've read would suggest with these Pygmy people that there are real genetic differences, and diet alone wouldn't be enough. Although it probably makes some difference, probably. Yes.
I think it's in parts of adaptation to the rainforest climate, because people like Tutsis were in the savannah, so
Right.
it's like a completely different environment. Yes. Just in terms of like heat exchange and things like that, humidity and all that.
Yeah, that long body shape is really good for shedding heat. And so out on the open savanna with your cattle, you often have to be out in the noonday sun a lot. And so that's considered an adaptation for cooling, really. This linearity, sort of, if you will. Compared to Inuit or Eskimo, Coltan, very short, very stocky. And you can see this in wildlife as well. You just look at the size of ears in something like foxes. The hotter the climate, the bigger the ears are. It's for shedding heat. And so yeah, that's a really good point. Some of these so-called Nilotic people tend to be some of the tallest people in the world. And again, there seems to be real genetic adaptation. People of southern Sudan, very tall, in general. Anyway, sort of back historically, this is a map that it's showing different time periods, but it's just showing what had been some of the larger pre-colonial states and empires in Africa. So in many parts of Africa, you never really saw state-level societies. You saw societies organized around villages or clans, small scale, nothing large and complex. But in West Africa especially, and this is by no means showing all of them, but West Africa, especially the Sahel belt, just south of the Sahara, you found lots of complex states going back 1,000 years or more, but you also had some here. So the Congo Kingdom was a pretty powerful state. When the Portuguese first got there in the 1400s, they found a powerful indigenous state, and they dealt with it extensively. There was a lot of missionization, a lot of the people of this key Congo-speaking area converted to Christianity, even back in the 1500s. The other big area of the state was the Luba people. We still see the Luba-speaking zone today in this part of Congo. The Luba formed an early state. Lunda actually were another group that sort of emulated them, but they had a real ideology of sort of divine kingship almost. So fairly complex bureaucracies, lots of mythical elements of kingship and of rule. And it maintained its state all the way up into the late 1800s. And it was undone by ivory and slave traders from the eastern coast pushing inland from the east, and the Belgians pushing in from the west. They were caught between, and their kingdom was essentially destroyed. but there have been more recent efforts to bring it back, which I'll get to as well. And one reason why this kingdom was so powerful is because they had pretty advanced metallurgy, and they were mining even down here into the copper area. They had extensive copper mines. They were trading copper. So pretty sophisticated in a variety of different ways. And looking at them today, I found a lot of aspects were on art auction sites, where evidently there's quite a demand for some of their artistic productions from. So this is something being auctioned. I can't remember which auction house it was, but an example of Luba art. Well, anyway, there had been some Christian missionaries in the coastal area, but Europeans had not moved into the interior. I think they couldn't. They died. Ever seen the mortality figures for Europeans in Africa before quinine was widely used? Their life expectancy of a European was about a year if he went to Africa. So mortality rates were extraordinarily high. And it tells you something about the profits that were made in trading for gold, slaves, and ivory in Africa. The Europeans did go there. Because chances are you were going to die. But if you didn't, yeah, you might make a lot of money. So they simply did it. But by about 1850, quinine, which comes from a bark in South America, if you use it extensively, it will not cure malaria, but it sort of can keep it under control. And malaria is the great killer in most of these areas. There's others, the yellow fever, like the problems disappeared. But after 1850, Europeans could go there and have a pretty good chance of surviving for a number of years. Missionaries went in there. Obviously, you've heard of Stanley and Livingston. Livingston being the missionary who was missing. Stanley being a Welsh-American newspaper reporter sent to try to find him, and he did. And after that, Stanley was hired by Leopold II, King of Belgium. Now, Belgium is, as I put it in the post this morning, a contrived country. That might offend some people, but it came into existence in 1830. It had been the Austrian, well, it had been the Spanish Netherlands and the Austrian Netherlands. Then they connected it with the Dutch Republic, the Holland, and that didn't work. And so it finally became its own country, but linguistically split, speaking Flemish or Dutch in the north, French in the south. And Leopold really wanted to put Belgium on the map. It's kind of a pipsqueak country, didn't get much respect. He had great ambitions. So he hired Stanley and started colonizing in the Congo. And at the same time, other European countries were doing the same thing. The French were moving into the coastal region there. The Germans were on the other side. And they were worried that they were going to come to blows over their competition in Africa. So Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor, organized a conference in Berlin, 1884-1885, to create ground rules for divvying up Africa, which they did fairly effectively. And somehow Leopold convinced them that he should get most of Central Africa, not as a colony of Belgium, but as his own personal domain, his land. Not his government's, but his. So as you can see here, Leopold became the sole ruler of a population. Stanley had estimated at 30 million without a constitution, without international supervision, without having ever been there. That was his terrain. And he called it, sorry, jumping ahead. So here's just a map of what it was like. You can see the French were here. Leopold's agents were pushing up the river, and they divided. So you get a German sphere, a British sphere. Leopold got this vast sphere. You had to occupy it. That's part of the rules of the game. So this is his sphere, but he had to make good of it. He had to send in his agents. He had to make it economically worthwhile in that sense, which he did. Ironically calling it the Congo Free State. I don't think there's any more ironic geographical term in history. And I'll get to that in a second. Note how his agents pushed successfully the salient into Zambia in this copper belt. These are all Zambian copper cobalt mining areas. So that highly mineralized zone got divided between the British. This was one of Cecil Rhodes' endeavors, pushing up from South Africa, and the Belgians pushing down. But the brutality of Leopold's Congo Free State was had few parallels in world history. This was part of a time of the rubber boom, where suddenly You needed rubber for tires as bicycles and cars were being made and the like. Most rubber from South America, but there are vines in the tropical rainforest here that also produce a saleable kind of rubber, very difficult to extract. And Leopold's agents forced Congolese to gather this rubber in vast quantities. And if they didn't gather enough, first thing they'd do is start chopping off their hands, and then they'd start chopping off their heads. And this is well authenticated. It was a kind of a Holocaust, really. No one knows how many people died, but the numbers were vast. And it was such sort of campaigns of terror that people would flee, and agriculture was disrupted. You see, describes a raid to punish a villager, ordered to cut off the heads of the men and hang them on the village palisades, hang the women and children in the form of a cross. All of this as well. Look at this, cutting off hands. Hands were a sort of a currency. They came to be used for shortfall in rubber quotas to replace the people who demanded them. Force publique, this is the militia of the Belgians, paid bonuses on the basis of how many hands they collected. Later on in the 1990s, African militia leaders, particularly in, not here, but particularly in Sierra Leone and Liberia, were doing the same sort of thing, cutting off hands. But this is basically where it came from, this technique of terror. Basically terrorize the people so they will do your bidding. And it was Leopold and sort of his agents on the ground who pioneered this sort of thing. Yes?
Would that tend to make them unproductive, though, in terms of exploiting them?
One would certainly think, right, that it's not a long-term sort of thing. But it's, I don't know the rationale sort of behind it other than total conviction of their own superiority. Probably as a sort of thing where orders get passed down from on high that you have to collect so much rubber, and then people pass that down, and when you get right down to it, if you can't collect the rubber, what are you going to do? Well, just try to terrorize people so that they can do it. But yes, it certainly seems, just from a gross exploitative standpoint, it's something that would be very counterproductive in the long run. Certainly resulted in massive loss of population, which is ultimately what any economy is going to be based on. So, yeah, I mean, sometimes when you get to this sort of extremes of terror, it gets difficult to explain it simply on economic ground. I mean, there's something deeper and it's far more sinister involved, perhaps, when this sort of thing gets unleashed. Sometimes it can just take a life of its own. But we saw very similar things in Liberia, Sierra Leone in the 1990s. And again, that was to get resources. That was to get diamonds and other resources. If people didn't comply, hands cut off, people killed, entire villages wiped out. Generally, if you think you're in there for the long haul, you'll have a little less brutal techniques, but who knows. This just shows on the eve of World War I, so you can see Belgium's great colonial zone. Germans were next door. This was Rwanda and Burundi. After the end of World War I, Germany lost its colonies, so I just see Rwanda and Burundi went to Belgium. Britain took over what was then called Tanganyika. I should say, I left something out. 1908, things got, the horrific situation in the Congo came to wider attention. There were missionaries who saw what was going on. There were some British agents. They started writing about it. They started bringing it to attention. Lots of writers in the United States. Mark Twain, this was one of his campaigns against the horrors going on here. Joseph Conrad, if you've ever read Heart of Darkness, that alludes to this situation as well. So in 1908, Belgium took the Congo Free State away from Leopold, and then it became the Belgian Congo. And Belgium ruled it quite a bit better than Leopold, no doubt about that. I wouldn't say that it was any sort of beneficial rule or anything sort of altruistic, but the extreme horrors of the early period were gone. It was more orderly. It was less sort of hideously exploitative, if you will. Belgium continued to run the country up till 1960, when it decolonized really without giving a second thought. 1955, Belgium was going to be there for the long haul. In fact, they were talking about maybe gradual decolonization, maybe a 30-year plan. But basically the idea is they were still going to be there. But then in 1960, France basically pulled out of all of its colonies. Riots and rebellions started heating up in Belgian Congo, and the Belgian government decided, we're just going to get out of there. We are going to let Congo become independent. So there was virtually no preparation for independence, and that's crucial. It's Belgium there one day, thinking they're going to be there for a long time, and then a few months later, they're out. And that leads to a crisis almost immediately, the so-called Congo crisis, which they're putting here from 60 to 66. It's a very sort of complicated issue. One of the key figures is Patrice Lumumba. You've probably heard of Lumumba University, although they don't call it that anymore, right? Don't they call it like People's Friendship or something? Yeah, Wikipedia said they had changed it to People's Friendship University, but that's in Moscow anyway. That's an interesting set of alumni, if you ever looked at people who trained there. But Lumumba was, I think, as a postal clerk to begin with, somewhat educated. But after Belgium, when Belgium pulled up, they had an election, and he became prime minister. But almost immediately, the army mutinied. He had plans to raise the pay of all the civil servants except the people in the army, and the army was still composed of Belgian officers, and they didn't want to have anything to do with them. Other parts of the country started declaring independence. He called on the UN. The UN sort of equivocated. This is when Dag Hammarskjöld was sort of the chairman. Eventually, Lumumba turned to the Soviet Union for support. That's why there's a Lumumba University in Moscow. The US, Belgium, France, other countries didn't like that. Oh, here's a Russian stamp with him on there, to sort of his importance. And so basically by 1961, Lumumba was overthrown in a coup, was probably tortured and killed shortly after. He'd only been in power for a few months. But you had Katanga. This is where, again, where those big copper and coal mines are. It declared itself independent, and Belgium supported them. Belgium sent in troops to support this area because that's where the money was. That was by this time that was the real source of the revenue. Here's the Luba, who declared themselves independent. They actually tried to reestablish their kingdom. They asked the United States for help, but evidently none came in. Then you had Joseph Mobutu, who was a fairly low-level army officer who kicked out Lumumba. He got the backing of Belgium, the United States, and France. And then we had Antoine Gizengo, who's still alive and actually ran in the 2006 election, which was quite interesting. He got support from the Soviets and from Nasser in Egypt, who was championing anti-colonial sentiments, and so they were supporting him. And anyway, you got this complex series of wars. This was the heyday of the white mercenary. A lot of mercenaries from Europe were employed by varying groups, particularly Katanga down in the south, but plenty of other ones elsewhere. And I'm not going to go through all the ins and outs, but a very, very complex story. Just one issue was in 1964, another rebellion happened. This is called the Simba Rebellion. That's Swahili for lion. This was in the east, and they had captured 1,600 Europeans, Belgians, missionaries, and others, and basically were holding them hostage. I mean, that's a lot of hostages. And there was a large, Dragon Rouge operation that came in and freed most of the hostages, but not all of them. Plenty of them were killed. Here's Life magazine, Congo Martyr. He was a missionary who was killed at that time. So a very chaotic situation from 60 basically to 65. But ultimately, we have Joseph Mobutu, later Mobutu Sese Seko, who renamed himself. He renamed everything. He renamed the country Zaire, he renamed the river, he renamed all the cities. So it had been Stanleyville, becomes Kisangani, and so on. All these Belgian names, they're out. Leopoldville, that becomes Kinshasa. And a lot of those changes have remained, except the name of the country. When he went out, so did the name of Zaire. here we have, he renamed himself Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngendua, whatever. The great unstoppable warrior who goes from victory to victory. Mobutu was one of the world's greatest kleptocrats, thief rulers, if you will. So here's a list of the 10 greatest thief rulers in recent history. Suharto of Indonesia stole somewhere between 15 and 35 billion, and Ferdinand Marcos made off between 5 and 10, and here's Mobutu Sese Seko with 5 billion. But consider how much poorer Congo is than Indonesia or the Philippines. So in relative terms, no one has been a thief like Mobutu, really. He's, I'd say, the champion thief probably of all history, at least of recent history, of greatly enriching himself and impoverishing his country at the same time. But he did bring an aspect of political stability for a long time. There were no longer, after 65, there were no longer communist threats. That was true in other parts of Africa, but he kept the communists out of power, so he was supported by the U.S. and by Western states, and maintained his regime as the country collapsed. He liked boxing, and there was a huge match. And actually, there's a very interesting film made of that. Did anyone see what's it called? That was the name of the film?
No,
When We Were Kings, was that it? But supposedly there were people being tortured underneath the stadium where they were boxing, while it was going on. Vast amounts of money spent on these sorts of prestige projects, if you will. So yeah.
I just had a question about Mobutu. Do you think that he was able to remain in power 32 years, you said?
Yeah.
So 32 years after Luba gets tossed off the back of the plane or whatever, and then you have all these other guys vying for power. He was in charge of the army, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So was it the U.S. backing, or do you think the fact that he controlled the army allowed him to remain in power?
The army had split too. And there were, in the early periods, there were even Che Guevara was there in the East, and there were Cubans, actually Cubans on both sides, the Cuban exiles and communist Cubans as well. It's really hard to say. Had he not had backing from both European countries and the United States, he probably would not have been. I almost certainly would not have been able. But that was not the only reason he had power. He did have his own power base, and was probably fairly brutally effective in some ways as a ruler. So, probably a pretty complex story. His end came when the beginning of the end sort of came with the Rwandan genocide. Remember, the economy was collapsing, infrastructure was falling apart, hyperinflation. It was a rotting hulk of a state, if you will. And then in 1994, there was the Rwandan genocide, where the Hutus, whipped into frenzy by radio hardcore nationalists, attacked the Tutsi minority. And remember, the Tutsis had been sort of the traditional aristocracy, if you will. Vast numbers of them killed, hundreds of thousands, mostly hacked by machetes. But then the Tutsis came back, partly because there were lots of Tutsis elsewhere, Tutsis in Congo, who had the language categories slop across the borders. So there were Tutsis outside of it. Then came back, expelled the genocidal regime, and established a relatively secure country in Rwanda. In Rwanda today, it's illegal to say you're Hutu or Tutsi. They're really trying to make a post-ethnic state with a certain amount of success, although not perfectly by any means. But this problem slopped over because once the Tutsis reestablished rule in Rwanda, they face a problem of a lot of these Hutu militias, people who had been guilty of genocide, fleeing into Congo, into eastern Congo, and continuing to attack them. So for this new Rwandan state on a pretty fragile foundation, right, they had just been through this horrific act of genocide, this was seen as intolerable. It was seen as really weakening them. You had these Hutu militias, vicious as can be, right there, next door, right across the border. So the government of Rwanda decided in 1996, 2 years after this genocide, that they had to get a new regime in what had been Zaire. They found, here's this problem. Again, you can just see, Hutu paramilitaries, Tutsi paramilitaries, both in this area of eastern Congo. What Rwanda does is they find a champion. They find Laurent Kabila, who was an all-time revolutionary leader. It's interesting, Che Guevara had assisted him. And Guevara's opinion was that Kabila was then 26, was probably the best leader around, but was more interested in alcohol and women than fighting. But he stayed in the bush and continued to be a revolutionary leader all the way through. So, even though Mobutu had relative stability, never entirely, there were still rebels out there. He never had firm control over all of it. So anyway, Cold War's over. Kabila's no longer a communist. He's now a nationalist, I suppose. Rwanda thinks he's the best person. They give him troops. They give him weapons. They give him money. And boom, he knocks out. Mobutu is dying of prostate cancer while his country is falling apart. Within a matter of months, Kabila is able to overthrow the old regime, renames the country Democratic Republic of Congo, and establishes his rule. But, problems. Well, he was rather corrupt and authoritarian, at least many people said. Not very democratic, pro-democracy groups abandoning him. But the real problem was he decided he no longer needed his Rwandan backers. Now he now has this whole country, a huge country, it's his. So he dismissed all ethnic Tutsis. Remember, it's the Tutsis running Rwanda now. They're the ones who were backing him. Dismisses them, orders Rwandan officials to leave DRC. Well, what do you think Rwanda says about this? Forget it. Time to overthrow the government of Congo again. Right after it. I mean, that just says something. Think about a tiny little Rwanda. Vast Congo. Rwanda's just been through genocide, and Congo is its pawn. Right? That they can do with it what they want. Well, almost. What happened was in the Second Congo War, Rwanda now had allies with Uganda for a while, temporarily, and Burundi even. So you can see Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. They, again, their armies are going across it, and then they do this amazing thing. They one group of Rwandan Tutsis commandeer 3 airplanes, fly all the way over to the Pacific Coast port, encourage local people to betray Kabila and join them, and they are marching up towards Kinshasa, the capital. So there's forces coming in from both sides. I think I made a map of this. Maybe this says it. So you've got Ugandan forces moving in the north, Rwandan forces here, going down to try to get the mines, and then they fly 3 airplanes. I mean, just to show you how small some of these battles are. Just with 3, fly over here, convince a bunch of people in the army to mutiny and join you, marching towards Kinshasa. Sorry, I should have put these maps in the other order. Well, at this time, Angola gets worried, in Zimbabwe, in Namibia, and actually even Chad and Libya for a short period of time. They don't want Rwanda taking over Congo. They know about all those resources, and they're worried about Rwanda becoming too powerful. They're worried about Uganda as well. So they support the Kabila government. So now that's where you get what is sometimes called the African Civil War, or the World War of Africa, it's sometimes called, because you've got Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi on one side, and then Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe. Basically, Chad was a disaster. Some people think Chad entered it because the French wanted them to. Because the French wanted to encourage Francophone Africa. Well, let's not go there. That's probably just speculation. But anyway, you end up dividing. But then, of course, Uganda and Rwanda have a falling out. And they start fighting against each other. Kisangani, the 3rd largest city, gets almost ruined in I think, 1999. The cathedral destroyed and other buildings because Rwandan and Ugandan had been allies. Now they're fighting each other. Why? Because it's descending into resource wars. That's what it's becoming. So you get lines start sort of being said. Kabila's assassinated, one of his inner people. He's succeeded by his son, who's president now. That was 2001. But by 2003, you basically have sort of a government sort of controlled area, needing Angola support. Angola's got lots of oil. Angola had a long civil war. It's got a pretty capable military. So it's Angola supporting the government. Rwanda basically having this area. Uganda having that area, which they run through their militias. They're not running it directly. Now here's a nice map actually sort of breaking down some of these different militias and showing sort of the zones of conflict. But it continued this way for several years, mounting death toll as these militias fight for resources and the like. Finally, the international community has enough, and very, very deep efforts were made to bring the groups together, to have national reconciliation, to have an election. And this is 2004, 2005. And in 2006, they do indeed have an election. Note that it costs almost $500 million. Remember, the annual revenues are $700 million. That was all paid for by foreign donors. But evidently, it was a pretty good election. Pretty fair as these go. So here's Kabila, the son, not the father, Joseph Kabila. Originally from this area, Swahili-speaking, and you can see winning in the Swahili-speaking areas. Here's Gizenga, who had been Patrice Lumumba's lieutenant back in the early 60s, totally dominating most of the Kikongo-speaking areas. Lingala-speaking areas here, we have Mobutu's son, and we have Joseph Bemba. I'll come to him later on, sort of splitting the vote. The Luba areas, it's interesting. This is this old kingdom. Luba area probably would have made a pretty good country in a way, but they were split. They were not able to decide on a single candidate. You have a runoff, and notice totally split. So Kabila taking the Swahili-speaking areas, Bemba taking everything else, essentially. And Kabila wins, but Bemba refuses to accept the election. Starts fighting against him, although eventually he sort of agrees to quit fighting. I have to throw in him. So Jean-Pierre, I got his first name wrong, sorry, Jean-Pierre Bemba. Very wealthy, owns lots of big companies. He had been heavily in cahoots with Mobutu back in the bad old days, if you will. Here have been some real problems. Denied allegations of cannibalism, saying the Pygmies are still alive and well. And finally, in 2008, was arrested near Brussels, made the mistake of going to Europe, and he's now being held by the International Criminal Court and is going to be charged. So that's what happened to Bemba. Okay, I know it's a dismal story, but there's still worse to come, really, in a way, more complicated. Here's a nice language map from the ethnologue showing actual language groups in the northern half of the country. So we're just cutting it in half here. Here's the north. Let's go to this area here, right on the border with Uganda, an area where there's coltan and other resources. You can see complex division. And you ended up with one of these, what might be called a tribal war, the Lendu and the Hima. One group, the Lendu being mostly farmers, the Hima being mostly pastoralists, although the language is the reverse of what you might think. It's the pastoralist people who speak a Bantu language and the farming people who speak a Nilotic language, and that goes against the way it usually is. Although as you start looking into it more closely, you find actually the southern, I just invented that border. I don't know where it is, but I did find out that the southern Lendu actually don't speak Lendu, they speak Hima. So it's not just language. Language is a marker, but there are other issues as well. They ended up in an incredibly nasty war, and they borrowed the ethnic ideology of the Hutu-Tutsi standoff. The Lendu started thinking of themselves as kin to the Hutu, and the Hima identified themselves with the Tutsis. A little basis for the new formation, but that's ideas became powerful, and they ended up with just a sort of a hideously nasty war fighting against each other. UN has tried many, there's still a large UN operation there, trying to intercede between them. But actually, a Lendu nationalist group murdered a number of Bangladeshi peacekeepers. There there have been lots of scandals involving the UN here, of UN soldiers doing nothing while people are slaughtering civilians right next door, of UN peacekeepers being involved in illicit trade in minerals, being involved in rape as well. So the UN has not kept clean hands by any means in this conflict. But that's a pretty difficult situation for these UN peacekeepers. Just to show you the Hutu militias who want to overthrow Rwanda, still active in some of these zones. Okay, I only have a few more people to bring in, but the fact that you still have these Hutu militias, and they're still there today, wanting to, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Rwanda. That's the group. So here's Rwanda, here are these various Hutu militias. So local Tutsi leaders just couldn't tolerate this, at least some of them. So another important figure to look at in this case is Laurent Nkunda, a Tutsi leader, had been part of the army. He broke off from the army because he said they're not taking on the Hutu militia. So he formed his own militia to attack them. Of course, he got involved in resource raiding and looting himself. So again, you have Hutu versus Tutsi fighting it out in eastern Congo. And I mentioned in the blog, if you read it, that Virunga National Park, which has more mountain gorillas than any other place, and it's just valiant efforts to try to keep them alive. But Nkunda invaded the park, expelled all the wardens, the rangers, but then he had a change of heart, invited them back, and said that he was going to build it up as a tourist destination. An ambitious guy. But then last year, the government of Congo and the government, there's Virunga right there, government of Congo and government of Rwanda made a deal that Rwanda would not only quit supporting him, they would actually arrest him. So he's currently under arrest in Rwanda. He had been receiving help from them, but the government of Congo said to Rwanda, if we want peace, you can't have this Tutsi militia leader. You got to get rid of him. So Rwanda did. So supposedly that's an effort to try to make peace. But I should mention too. I'm not even talking about the Mai militias. These were militias established to try to let people protect themselves, give them guns. But then a lot of them started doing the same thing. Resource looting, fighting, and so there are so many different militias here. I don't know if anyone can keep track of them. Finally, the last issue, and this is really, in a way, one of the most horrible ones, is Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army. Kony is from Uganda, from northern Uganda. And Uganda, like other African countries, has some big ethnic issues. It's the Buganda people in the south who sort of dominate. There's a large ethnic group in the north called the Akoli. The Akoli have been got the short end of the deal for a long time. And in the 1980s, you got these sort of syncretic Christian revival movements spreading. And do I have I think I might have a source on here. It actually started with a woman, Alice Lakwema, who claimed she had been inspired by the Holy Spirit, saw herself as a prophet, believed that the Akoli could defeat the government run by Museveni, leader of Uganda, by casting off witchcraft and spiritualism, becoming Christians in a manner of speaking. They covered their body with shea nut oil that would protect them from bullets. I don't know why you couldn't kill snakes or bees, but it was a sort of a... Well, you found many of these sort of movements, sort of magical movements among people who've been victimized, and a leader will come and say, I have spiritual authority, and God will protect me. And so this started happening in the 80s, but then Joseph Kony took over and organized it into a military arm, and a group of that has been responsible for some of the most extreme terror anywhere. It's interesting, Kony decided to have over 60 wives. Lots of women are enslaved for sexual purposes by this group, which claims to be a Christian group, interestingly enough. Here are areas in Uganda, I don't know if we can see it here. we're giving percent, it's hard to see, percent population displacement. But where some areas 95% of the population displaced. People so terrorized by the LRA that they won't even leave their villages at night. And they can't get firewood, they can't get food. So it was, and this is the Akoli people, the people he was supposedly protecting, but ended up victimizing them to an extreme degree. Well, Uganda finally had enough and had a military offensive and kicked the LRA out of Uganda. Well, where do they go? The LRA goes to Garamba National Park. And this is, talk about ironies. This was the last remaining home of the northern white rhinoceros. There's a southern white rhino population. This is the last one. And it had been pretty well preserved, but that meant it's a big wilderness area. Sanctuary, possible sanctuary for rebels. So Joseph Kony took the LRA into Garamba. He is there to this day. Uganda and Congo together tried to, in December 2008, something they called Operation Lightning Thunder. And it's hard to see this, it's fuzzy because I expanded, but this is obviously, it's a Ugandan military poster. And here you have the Ugandan military forces, sitting on the, what are they sitting on here exactly? With their sights on Garamba, they're going to come in. Well, they came in, they failed to find Kony. They really failed to defeat the LRA, and then the LRA went on an orgy of reprisals, killing thousands and mutilating and killing thousands of civilians in the area. So this was a disaster. And here's a good map of villages they've attacked. Attacked 47 more than once. Attacked 3 times 5. Attacked 8 times one village. Often what they will do, they'll take all the children and force them to become fighters. LRA is infamous for its child soldiers, some as old as 8 or 9. Use drugs and force them to do. They'll use brutality as a way of breaking down children to sort of make them their own, forcing the children to hack people to death and this sort of thing. And the LRA has been as bad as any group we've ever had. Yes?
One of the interesting aspects of this is that it prohibits any aid from getting to Sudan. Because anything that comes up from Tanzania, Kenya, or Uganda gets basically stopped by the Lords and can't get into Sudan.
So for southern Sudan, absolutely, which is would be an interesting story itself. If we had more time, that's another place we would probably want to cover. But yeah, there are some big problems here. Sudan has an election scheduled for next year, 2011. And supposedly, South Sudan will be able to vote on independence. I wouldn't count on it. I don't think the Khartoum government's going to let that happen. But that supposedly is the situation.
And even though the Lords are limited right up to the border area, pick up a newspaper in Kampala every day. There's a story about the Lords on the front page.
Yeah. And this is happening all the time. And the newspaper articles that I went through at the beginning, most of those were the LRA. Because actually, a lot of the other militias, they're not as violent now as they were a few years ago. In most areas, the violence has died down to some degree. They're still there, still going on. But this group is sort of new to the scene. They've moved in, and they are as violent as any of them. And you just see the bloodshed. That may be my last slide. Yeah, I just ended with there, so I know that I'm done. So we've got about 20 minutes or so for general comments and discussion. Yes?
Where are the arms coming for all these conflicts, and where's the money coming from?
So the money's coming from the resources, right? From the coltan, from the gold, from the diamonds, from the tin ore, by and large.
Through the government?
No, just different. No, so different militias. They enslave people and they force them to mine, and then they are selling this. That would be very interesting to see how it's getting out and what sort of pathways. But it's sort of independent of the government. The government's involved as well, but that's why the militias will fight so fiercely over mineral areas, because that's where the money comes from. Most of the money. They're not getting. Often you get countries supporting rebels on other sides of the border. That's certainly true where Sudan and Chad have supported each other's rebels. Supposedly they're not going to do that now. Sudan at one point was supporting the Lord's Resistance Army, but I don't think they are anymore. You probably know more about this than I do. I don't think they are. Right now, they're at least ostensibly they're not doing it. So the other question: where do the arms come from? A lot of this is just small arms, AK-47s, which are pretty cheap and easily made. There's lots of international arms merchants around the world. There's actually been a couple of films made about this. What was it? Lords of War was one with Nicolas Cage, which was that the name of which was looking more at Liberia and Sierra Leone. Some of these are the infamous Russian, or was it Ukrainian? Victor Bots? Boots, right. Pardon? He's Tajik. Oh, that's right. I think, isn't he in prison in Thailand right now?
Yeah,
Right.
I think so. I think he had some, I'm not sure, but probably there's some connection with the Russian security forces.
With Russian security forces, yeah. And the Russian connection goes way back to Lumumba and earlier, so that, in a way, it's nothing new. So yeah, there are plenty of international arms merchants, and with these sort of small arms, they're cheap and they're accessible, and there's a lot of them. I mean, that's another thing too. That this Lendu Hema War, they used to fight with bow and arrows, and then suddenly there's AK-47s. That makes it a completely different situation when suddenly you've got lots of small arms easily accessible. Yeah.
You had that really great slide earlier on showing the infrastructure and or the lack of any transportation infrastructure. Really, it seems like how do you get all the resources from mining out if given like the lack of that?
Yeah. Well, most of the real mineral-rich areas are on the eastern border. So they're quite close to Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, which, comparatively speaking, have good infrastructure. They're not good infrastructure by our standards, but compared to DR Congo, it is pretty good. I must admit, I don't know a whole lot about actual mineral trade. They got this coltan, and what precisely are they doing with it? How is it being transported? How is it being sold? Anybody knows, please share your knowledge. That just was something I didn't have time to look into in any depth and figure out how that's being done. There certainly have been criticisms of international firms being involved in this. There have been a lot of human rights organizations trying to bring this to international attention. That's been especially true with diamonds. When Sierra Leone and Liberia were these horror zones, there were these big efforts to have diamond certification, so you'd buy diamonds and know they weren't being mined by slave labor in Sierra Leone, that sort of thing. Is that happening with coltan? I haven't read anything about that. I really don't know. You may know more about this.
I just think one of the themes is that China, which is relatively resource poor, is investing very substantial amounts of money in these mines,
right,
and providing leadership in these countries with resources to build infrastructure,
absolutely,
etc., in return for very long-term arrangements for the minerals.
No strings tying them together. There was a real push by Western countries and Japan and others in the 90s to tie development aid to good governance in Africa. And there was a lot of optimism that this would work. And there was a big project, it's the Chad-Cameroon pipeline. So Chad discovers oil. How are you going to get it out? A very expensive pipeline built through Cameroon. It was all negotiated so that most of the money would be earmarked for education and public health and these sorts of things. And there was a lot of optimism that this would work. Now that's fallen apart, and Chad is no longer honoring those commitments. And there's a lot of reasons, but one is precisely China coming in and saying, we will provide you low-interest loans. We will build infrastructure. We will bring in Chinese workers. There are over 1 million Chinese people in Africa now. So it's mining. It's even agricultural production, leasing land. It's not just the Chinese, too. Actually, even some of the Middle Eastern countries have been doing these long-term land leases, especially in Sudan. Angola, Sudan, and Zimbabwe have major Chinese investment, and that's been very important in sort of freeing the governments from these sort of constraints and bringing it. So, Like I said, I found it interesting that there were so many articles in the Chinese news agencies on DR Congo. I don't think China's investment here isn't nearly what you have in Sudan and Angola. That's where it's really big. But of course, there's a lot of interest in this area because it has just so much in the way of resources. Yes.
If you invest in a country, China, for example,
Right.
and then the government's overturned, what happens to the contract?
Oh, okay. So if a country, say over here, has a change of government, and you have these long, well, yeah, I guess it depends on whether or not the new government is going to honor those contracts. If they want continued relations with China, they probably are going to do that because it would be beneficial for them. I'm sorry, I should say. But I suppose you couldn't necessarily count on that happening. Interesting question. I don't know. Does anyone have any insight on that? Yeah, I'll just look into that some more. Yes.
I think of Venezuela in this case because Chevron was a huge producer, developed an enormous infrastructure.
Yes.
So that is nationalized.
Yes.
And recently invited them back.
Yeah, right.
And they came.
They came.
So it's where the money goes.
Yeah. So I mean, the U.S. oil companies don't have a very large percentage of the oil reserves under their control anymore. The oil reserves are controlled by countries and their state-owned oil companies. That's where most. So U.S. oil firms have to play these games in many areas if they want to get involved. I wouldn't be surprised if Chavez were to re-expropriate from them, but they've obviously taken that risk. I'm sure they've analyzed it very, very carefully, looking at possible payoffs.
There's probably some strange, obscure form of insurance for this.
Oh yeah, I bet that's true. There probably is. It carries a lot of risk. Yeah. If you want to look at big sort of risk factors, yes.
Didn't either the CIA or our military play some role in that December 2008 operation against the Lord's Resistance?
Yeah, it's rumored that there was some assistance, not overtly, and a lot of these sort of are rumors. It was mostly Uganda doing it. Uganda is considered to have a pretty capable military for this area. They did chase the Lord's Resistance Army out of Uganda itself. Part of it, there's this huge logistical problems if you're trying to move over these sort of areas without roads, without infrastructure, and then a great big national park with it's pretty wild terrain. It's not easy to do it, and Uganda wouldn't have. I mean, you'd really need to locate. Well, look at the United States trying to locate Osama bin Laden, right? Yeah, not easy to do with all of what the U.S. has. Now, I don't imagine that Joseph Kony has that kind of sophisticated operation, but it's pretty easy to hide in a lot of these areas if you know the area. But that group is a mystery to me to try to understand the ideology behind it.
In the early days, the big thing was the secession of Katanga.
Right.
That doesn't seem to figure in the story at all now. Katanga is no longer significant.
Well, it still is. So that's the area down here that has these big, heavily capitalized copper and cobalt mines. But the secession movement there really was almost successful because it had the backing of Belgium and it had the backing of big Western-oriented multinational firms that put resources into helping Katanga secede. Now, the UN then came in and passed a resolution denouncing that. Pressure was put on Belgium. Belgium sort of pulled out. The UN made a very clear decision in 1960 that they would do everything to keep Congo together. And that's, I think, something that we really got to wonder about. The international community has, since World War II, had the view that countries should never divide up, or if they do, it should be done in a very sort of gradual, careful way. And I can sort of understand that. But at the same time, insisting the Congo stick together, I really doubt the wisdom of that. Looking at just the basic geography of it, I just think it would work a lot better if it were divided into several. I think it's too big of a country. It's universe. It lacks any sort of core or center. So I just wonder about the UN decision. But now, of course, it's easy to say that. Had they decided otherwise, maybe it would have turned out to be worse. Maybe those countries would have fought each other much more viciously. And who knows? But it is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, trying to figure out: is this really a wise policy to insist that these states remain as they are? African leaders think so. African leaders say, don't you dare let any country divide up, because then the precedent will be set and we could all divide up, and it would be horrible for Africa. But I just don't see the DRC making a whole lot of sense as a country. I think the eastern areas could function much more effectively as an independent area. This zone could, southern zone could as well. But who knows? But it's something interesting to think about. Yes.
When you're talking about all of this, you're talking about all kinds of sources that come into you together. How do you sift through what's rumor, what's happening, what's what?
Yeah, I mean, how do we know what we know out of this area? The information is pretty scanty, and just trying to find information on provinces of the DR Congo. Most of it, I just couldn't find anything on large areas of the country. There isn't much information out there. And the information that does come out, you've got your news agencies, and supposedly it's their job to sift through. You've got a lot of NGOs. You've got the UN. So you do have a lot of outsiders there. Catholic Church. So there are lots of organizations, and some Protestant churches as well. There are organizations really dedicated to trying to make things better, and they're collecting information. So you have to look at a variety of different sources, but often I'll give you information and I'll say, be wary, because how do we know? And you look at the death toll. Is it 900,000 or is it 6.7 million? I mean, that's a huge difference, and we really don't know. And maybe we'll never know. Maybe there's no way of knowing, because so many deaths. It's people who've been weakened through not getting enough food and having to move and being terrified, having the stress. And how then do you figure, is this a war death or is it something else? So never easy. Yes.
When you say between a little under 1 million and 6 million, is that uncertainty as to just cause? We know there were 10 million deaths during that year, and it's just breaking it up, or is it we don't know whether there's 1 million or 10 million deaths?
I think more the former, but a little bit of the latter. So those death rates of 5.4 is the usual figure, 5.6 that you see. So that is based on known deaths, but the question is, what was the actual cause? Okay. But even that figure. Probably pretty suspect, because it's not like you've got government agents out there recording all the deaths by any means. There's lots of people are often killed and thrown into unmarked graves and sort of thing. So there's a lot of guesswork. There's a lot of estimation, but there are a lot of people working very hard at it. NGOs particularly, and others who it's their job to try to figure this out. And so people travel from the region and interview people and really do what they can to figure this out to the extent that one can, I suppose. Must be some other parts. Oh, yes.
This is a little bit off the topic, but why are there all these French islands out here?
Yeah, I have. Do I have? I have. Well, somewhere on the computer, I have a map of France's, what I call France's Oceanic Empire. Now, when decolonization occurred, it didn't occur everywhere. There are plenty of islands that were never let go. So France has French Polynesia, which is vast, New Caledonia, and some pretty big islands. Now, Réunion is not a French colony. That's an overseas department. It's an integral part of France. It's as much part of France as Hawaii is part of the United States. Mauritius is an independent country. You have the Comoros, which are independent, but there's one island in the Comoros called Mayotte, which is a French colony. I think it's an overseas collectivity. They have these different categories of their colonies, and a bunch of very small islands. Well, France did have all of Madagascar If you go back to the Berlin Conference, this was a French zone. So the big island, mini continent, that's what Madagascar really is. But then a lot of islands. 1960, Madagascar becomes independent, but France keeps these small islands. Some of them, like this one, I didn't even know. Some of these are uninhabited. Mayo definitely has quite a few people, but a lot of these islands really don't have much in the way of habitation at all. But because you've got 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone around any island, unless there's another island and then you split the difference, that gives France, well, not just France, the United States has a lot, Britain has a lot, New Zealand, Australia, a number of countries have these oceanic empires, if you will. But that gives you potentially a lot of territory, and it's not very valuable right now, but you do have, by international law, 200 nautical miles, it's yours economically. Any fish, any resources on the seabed, and the seabed does have a lot of resources. It's so expensive to get them up now, but there's manganese nodules, there's all kinds of stuff on the abyssal plain, down at 15,000 feet below the sea. So that is, I suppose, some significance. St. Helena, that's British. So Britain has a bunch in the Atlantic Ocean. France has a lot, especially around the Antarctic, what are called sub-Antarctic islands. Some of them are really quite large. Uninhabited, except there's always scientific and military personnel on it. So that's a different, but interesting topic in its own right. Thanks for bringing that up. Yes?
Martin, how does the 70 million population in the Democratic Republic of Congo compare to other population centers in Africa?
Nigeria is the big one. Nigeria is the demographic core. It probably has about 140 million, although nobody really knows. Ethiopia would be next at somewhere between 70 and 80 million population. South Africa, I think, is about 50. I'd have to check South Africa, maybe a little bit less than that. But some countries very sparse. Central African Republic only has, I think, 3-4 million people. Sudan has about 40, so Sudan has quite a bit. Countries further to the west are very sparse. Gabon only has about 1.5 million people. Gabon has a lot of oil. Per capita, it looks pretty well off, but the money is all dominated by a very, very small part of the population. Republic of the Congo, I'd have to check, maybe 6 million, something like that. Rwanda and Burundi are very dense, but they're very small, obviously, but their populations are on the order of, I think about 8 or 9 million each. Kenya's what, 40 million? If anyone knows these figures better than I do, please feel free to jump in. Uganda, 30 maybe? So more than most of its neighbors, to be sure. Yes?
Can you just point to where the Islam influence kind of ends?
Yeah, absolutely. So estimated 5 to 10% of the population in DRC is Muslim. In the Swahili area, most of the people are not. Supposedly mostly Christian, more Catholic than Protestant, but there's a lot of sort of syncretic, half Christian, half indigenous faith. But you have the Swahili coast here, so coastal Tanzania, coastal Kenya, and then all of Somalia, a big chunk of Ethiopia, basically running about like so. Eritrea is about 50-50 Christian Muslim. Ethiopia is probably 60% Christian, 40% Muslim. And then your line over here, Guinea, they say Guinea's 90% Muslim and 90% animist. So, but it cuts through northern Cote d'Ivoire, through this part of Ghana here, right about through the middle of Nigeria. Big struggle in central Nigeria because Christian South, Muslim North, and then the central zone. Big area fighting. Northern Cameroon, Chad, this area is Christian and animist, but mostly it's Muslim. And then in Sudan, it runs right about like so. So that would be, so Muslim to the north, mostly Christian, mixed with animism to the south. But then it's also a little bit spotty. So like I say, this area is never mapped as Muslim, but you do have a certain percentage of the population that is Muslim because Swahili traders from the coast here were moving into the central part of the continent right about the same time the Europeans were, trading for slaves, ivory as much as anything else, and there was a lot of sort of competition for the zones anywhere, which Europeans obviously wanted that. One more question, yes.
On your colonial Africa map, I don't recall what Ethiopia was coded with. Was that not?
It's very interesting. Italy tried to conquer Ethiopia, and in 1896, Ethiopia defeated Italy in a major war. And Italy came back for revenge in the 1930s under Mussolini when they had airplanes that could bomb the heck out of Ethiopia, and they did. So Italy ruled it for a couple of years, and then I think it was 1941, Britain came in and kicked the Italians out. There was only a couple of years where Italy ruled Ethiopia. Italy did rule Eritrea, did rule much of Somalia, but Ethiopia was basically not colonized. It was really the only African country you could say that for. Liberia is shown as never having been colonized, but Liberia was set up as a country for former slaves in the Americas who went back. But anyway, we are out of time. Thank you so much. Suggestions for next week? Several people have asked me to do something on Southeast Asia. Big question is, should I continue with wars and conflict, or should I try to do something a little bit less dismal? Feel free to send me suggestions. I'll make a decision in the next couple days, but I'd love to hear your feedback. Whatever you'd like me to take on, I'll be happy to give it a try.
So how is it that China doesn't have any troops anywhere here yet?
That's
or is that coming?
I wonder.
Because I mean, it's like
China is rising up. See, China's never had much of a navy.
Yeah,
what they call it, Blue Water Navy, but they're building a
yeah, they're working. It takes a while. You don't build that overnight.
You don't do that overnight. It takes a long time. But to project force, you have to have a big
and at some point,
navy.
like, if they're making deals like, oh, here, we'll just give you money, and just sort of give us resources, etc.
Hey, thank you.
At some point, that has to.
What's your name?
Jeff Rowe. I'm here. It's about
Oh, wow.
that's why I'm here.
Well, that was very
So I've had a
helpful.
little experience with it.
Yeah, I can tell.
Thanks very much.
I'm doing mine on.
Plus, I don't know if we'll have time for, even though it's not in the news a lot, but kind of the Balkans.
Yeah, I really,
Just 'cause I thought the history, especially
I do want to do,
background would really be
like the former Yugoslavia. That's definitely a topic. So that will be why we have four more. So that will be one of the four. I definitely will do that.
Like, part of the world.
I was reading
Sure.
Oh
yes.
So, regarding, you said we have to have 5 maps. So is it something like the previous class
Yeah, but basically, I want people to explore some topic using maps and write about what a map shows, but also shows how one map can connect to another map. And the sort of thing I'm doing here all the time. And whatever topic you really want to pursue, basically fine with me. I just want people to play around with maps. Spend a lot of time looking at them, comparing them, going back and forth. Because it's not something that most people do. We sort of use maps passively, but to sort of use the maps more actively, just so how maps can inform each other. That's one of the things I'm looking for.
I'm thinking of maybe doing something on Thailand.
Oh, yeah, plenty you can do in Thailand. Yeah, there's a very nasty insurgency in southern Thailand. Again, people are being killed there every day, and you almost never hear about it. But southern Thailand is a real problem.
Invisible wars.
Yeah, it is. It's an invisible war.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do you want us to provide copies of the maps with the paper?
Yes, you can just Xerox them if you like, however you want to do it.
And what is the format that you're looking for?
No, I'm just looking for something like 8 maps or so. Find a region of the world. Not too big. Don't do South America. That's too big. Or Brazil would be too big. But you can do a smaller country if you wanted. Then you can find maps in various different sources. You can Xerox them out of books. You can find them on the internet, print them out, and just show how the maps connect to each other. Write about a couple paragraphs per map. One good way to think of it is a paragraph just explaining really what the map shows, and then another paragraph linking it to one or more of the other maps. to make a sort of a coherent discussion of some place, some issue.
Is there anything newsworthy in the Caribbean?
Yeah, Caribbean, yeah, there's a,
Other than Haiti.
right, well, there's a Haiti. Well, Cuba-Venezuela connection is very
Yes.
interesting. There's a New York Times had an article on Venecuba. I think
The
they were
Economist just had.
Oh, it's the Economist.
Economist
I know, I read that somewhere.
this week, yeah.
And there are several other smaller countries that are involved in that same connection. Dominica involved in that as well. That's an issue. There have been big problems with, the French Caribbean is interesting. Guadeloupe and Martinique. Like Réunion, these are integral parts of France, overseas departments. They had big riots last year. Cost of living is very high. A lot of people are upset that people from France control most of the local economy. So France had to send in troops to quell the rioting in Martinique and Guadeloupe. That was last year. That's pretty interesting. You have the Dutch Caribbean, which is interesting. Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao, St.
My roots
Martin.
are Trinidad.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
So,
Oh, and in Trinidad, you got the Afro-Trinidadians and the
and the
Indo-Trinidadians.
oil.
And the, oh yes, and the oil. I mean, that's an interesting issue as well. Yeah, you could do something in Trinidad.
And are you going to talk about Brazil at all in the 4 that are left?
Yeah, probably not. I wasn't really thinking about it. I want to do something in Southeast Asia, probably. I want to do the former Yugoslavia. I'm not sure what else.
Okay.
It probably depends on what people suggest. And like to do.
Okay, thank you.
I was just going to say, I'd love to hear about the development of Scotland and Britain and Scandinavia and how that all kind of came to be. We want to get away from all these disease, war centers and things like that. So
yeah, it's interesting. There's still a Scottish independence movement that wants to separate, and they got their parliament now and the like. So, that might be fun to do something like that. Yeah, thanks.
Yep, I'll second that one. But you were thinking of Burma and your expertise in that area. So, what were you thinking that would be interesting in that area?
Well, Burma itself is a big problem, issue with its repressive government. It's got lots of ethnic conflicts. Basically, it's the issue of the Burmans versus other peoples. You've got the so-called hill tribes. You've got opium connections. You've got Islam among a group called the Rohingyas who are in the coastal area. You've got those sorts of things. I have more expertise in Philippines. That's where I've done my own work, although I haven't done anything there not much for a long time. If I want to continue doing these sorts of wars and conflicts, southern Philippines, southern Thailand are areas that I would maybe want to cover. But like I say, I don't want to just do war and violence.
Yeah. So, I think I'd like to move.
Right. Something not quite so.
Well, sort of different areas where there are interesting issues going on, but not necessarily taking it all the way to the chopping off hands.
Okay,
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
An appreciation, for instance, the Afghani one.
Right.
Even though there is definitely violence and everything else,
Right.
still, I thought the fact that that you pointed out that there was that mountain range right through the middle of the country just changed my whole perspective on it.
Right.
So if there's some part of the world where the geography
Right, where physical geography
is really well, it's sort of like people are shaped by their houses they live in.
Right.
People are shaped by the physicality of the country they're in. I mean that just changed my whole perspective and turned on Afghanistan for me because I sort of looked at it and said, "Oh, okay, yeah, I know that the Soviets put a tunnel through, but you can only get so much traffic from tunnels, and so what else is going on?"
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm not saying specifically an area, but do you have some specific? As you look at things, is there an area that you would like to bring to our attention? Is what I'm saying, from your perspective.
Yeah. What I try to cover the globe, so I try not to focus on any one particular area. So I'd like to try to be able to do any place.
Okay, it's for water from point A to point B.
Oh. Yeah.
Places in the globe might be interesting. Of course, we've got California as a big example. There's
do.
water transfers in China.
Yeah.
Places that don't have
They're going up in the
transfers.
Tibetan Plateau, and they're diverting water from the Yangtze into the Yellow River. India is building big dams on the Indus River right now, which has Pakistan
And
very
they have had
concerned.
engineers for years
Right.
in India.
But that tends to have more economic focus than militaristic focus.
True. Yeah, although sort of potentials for
Oh, sure, there always are.
Israel and Palestinian territories, water is such a big issue there. Yeah, and it's California, you're looking at most of the Trinity rivers right into the Sacramento, and the Russian River. You know, the Russian River wouldn't flow in the summer if they didn't take 90% of the flow of the Eagle River and put it into the Russian River. So, yeah, those are all interesting topics and issues.
But I still come back to the climate change.
Well, this is,
Right, yeah.
and the two are tied together, of course, as well.
Oh, sure. Which is why I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. And there's lots of parts of the world that are just water stressed. Huge
Is that something you could jump on?
We could, yeah. Possible. The question would be to try to do it globally or try to focus in. And I'm also trying to link it to stories in the news. That's the sensible point of the class. So what I'd start doing is just looking for news articles and see how. And if I don't find any, then I would be probably reluctant to take them on. But if I find, I was just reading about India building these dams on the Indus just the other day. So it's something the Pakistanis are very concerned about. And I'm sure you well know. Pakistan is so dependent on the Indus River. So they, just like Egypt with the Nile, they see that as an existential threat if it starts controlling the headwaters. So, India and Bangladesh have had big water issues because India, during drought periods, they hold water back, and then during flood periods, they open it up, and Bangladesh gets it.
Yeah.
So that's an issue. There was an interesting article in The Economist on Bihar in India. Did you happen to see that?
No, I
Well,
didn't. I
Bihar is
missed it.
always at the bottom of every.
Right.
But supposedly, for the first time, they have a pretty competent government.
Yeah,
and
that,
organized crime is
I guess-
way down,
I
and
guess
they're
we did
starting
read
to.
that.
They're starting to
I didn't
really
see a specific
build.
thing, but it sounded
build-
like they were beginning to turn around a little bit.
Teachers are actually going and teaching. That wasn't happening for
Yeah,
so long.
there's still issues though, like
Oh,
the,
yes.
the plant for building potato nano
Mm.
was originally going to be in Bihar.
Oh,
but
was
there
it
were
really?
Big protests about land being taken for it, and they ended up locating it somewhere else.
Do you know where they're?
All the details.
Yeah. Oh,
I'm
that's-
pretty sure it was Bihar where it was going to be originally.
Huh.
You don't see the economists.
Well, yeah,
Because I don't think, I saw it in the Times, so that's.
yeah, but this all happened well over a year
Right.
ago now. So.
That's an interesting issue as well.
Is there anything in Scotland? I mean, I would love to have something in Scotland and Scandinavia, but I haven't seen anything popping up there.
Well, they do have Britain has an election coming up, and expect the Conservatives to win, but they never get many votes in Scotland. You had the Scottish Nationalist Party and Labour been contending for votes in Scotland. But just doing something of the British Isles, all in all. I mean, I'm really interested in places like the Isle of Man, because these anomalous areas that don't fit the geopolitical mold. It's not part of the United Kingdom. It's a kind of dependency. That means it has its own laws, and so you get these financial shenanigans going on. Supposedly, Channel Islands and Isle
Channel
of Man.
Islands, I mean, another one.
Right, yeah. That's where offshore banking came from. And they have a lot cleaner shows now than Cayman Islands and some of these other places. But it's still, there's financial irregularities going on in those places, which have, many people would say, allowed a lot of really rich people to avoid taxes and have put a lot of risk into the global financial situation. And there it is, right between Britain and Ireland. Then there are interesting cultural things too. I mean, they're trying to recreate the Manx language. People are learning that. I've done that with Cornish as well. But, I suppose that's not trivial, but I think those things are fun.
Oh yeah, I mean, there was a whole thing on the crossroads on the Celts, saying, maybe the
Celts if they had a more developed language. We wouldn't be seeing Indo-European, we would have seen a Celtic culture. And that was a very interesting article, in terms of just an argument for that.
Yeah, they had this fairly distinct form of Christianity for a while, and Celtic versus Roman, and Catholics finally.
Yeah, this was before even Rome was. They were saying
way
basically the Celts went down to Rome.
Oh, right, that's
but
true. They
didn't
did.
sack it, and so the hypothesis was, what if they had sacked Rome?
Yeah, it's like 395 BC or something.
And then history might have just been entirely different.
That's right.
And then what would have happened?
If Rome had never risen.
All sorts of good alternative histories.
Yeah.
And there are people who write these alternative histories,
Yeah.
and people do games with them. Sometimes I find maps, these bizarre maps. What is this? And it's some alternative history gaming world.
Yeah.
These maps.
One of my favorite science fiction authors wrote one that was predicated on the plague actually wiping out Europe.
Oh, really?
Just decimating it.
What was that?
Kim Stanley
Oh,
Robinson,
yeah.
Years of Rice and Salt.
Or Philip K. Dick wrote an interesting book on premise on.
High Castle.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks a lot.
Okay.
Appreciate your input, and we'll be thinking about what to do next.
Anything interesting in Japanese politics?
Yeah, well, the government is standing up to the United States for the first time, really, which is bringing up a lot of cleavages within Japan. There's that Okinawa basis issue. That's interesting. And of course, that brings up the North Korea question, and
That brings up the Russian, Japanese question of islands.
oh yes, the Kuril Islands and that issue. That's
So I think that
no
would be
shortages of things to
talk about. But I think that would be a fun one in terms of, I think we've run out of the era that's post Second World War in terms of Japanese. I mean, the old guard is dying off, and so it's beginning to have a whole shift. It's plus the fact of the crash of 89 and everything.
Never really recovered from
Yeah.
And then the rise of China, of course, scares the Japanese.
Scares
And the
me.
Japanese birth rate and depopulation in the islands.
Got that? Yeah, and Japan really not wanting to open up to immigration at all.
So their total population actually is dropping.
Yeah, it is. It's dropping.
And frankly, the Japanese moving back from South Latin America and acting like Latin Americans in Japan
Doesn't work.
doesn't work.
Yeah, I witnessed that one firsthand. That's a real cultural contrast. You come from Brazil to go to Japan. The rules are so different.
Yeah.
Let's let it go.
Okay, well, thanks. I appreciate it.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.